subject of this presentation is the basic objective of this presentation is to maybe explore how one could look at an integrated and comprehensive treatment of the different issues that should be addressed to ensure basically indefinite long-term sustainability of the entire power sector. What I'd like to focus on is the power generation part of that. It's really the foundation of the system. Obviously, there are very many important issues in transmission and distribution and consumption, but the generation sector, of course, is where a lot of the capital investments are. And so I want to focus on that part. So let me just take one brief moment, and I'm going to put up a few slides, and we'll discuss this a little bit further, okay? So bear with me just a slight moment. Okay, so Ramesh, you just confirm for me that you are able to see my slides?
I can, but I'm also, it's being interfered with another screen there. You may want to minimize that.
Okay, in my end, I only see the slides, so let me.
Yeah, I actually only saw the slides as well. I don't know what you were seeing, Rudy. Like I see the slides right now. That's it.
Okay.
Well,
all
if
right.
any participants having problems seeing the slides, they can send a message via the chat feature, then we can react to that. Otherwise, I'll proceed.
Okay.
So obviously, let me just move on here. And what I'd like to do to start this discussion is use a very simple analogy that I think is helpful in viewing the problem that I'd like to convey. And that's a medical analogy. I think everyone here has experienced medical care, has experienced the need to address different medical issues. And we are all accustomed to going to the doctor and addressing various issues. It might be related to cardiovascular health, neurological health, standard checkups, respiratory, whatever it is. The challenge, though, as an individual in receiving medical treatment is that you can receive detailed testing and evaluation in any one of those domains, and you will get help. A doctor will help you interpret, say, blood test results, for example. But when you sit down and look at the entire problem of how you would like to manage your health holistically across all those dimensions, you as the patient are left to integrate those different facets of your health into a body of considerations that lead to decisions that you might make about your life. The power generation system is very similar to that. There are many different, well understood, well studied issues. And there's a lot of information, data, and a lot of study on each of those areas, but the integration of those things into making the value judgments and the risk benefit judgments to develop a portfolio of generation technologies that balance all the risks and take advantage of the opportunities, that integrated process really doesn't exist in a holistic form. It emerges in a somewhat organic fashion, as I'll discuss further. So the first thing I want to do here is I just want to define what I really mean by sustainability here. I'll also preface this by just saying that clearly, there are different ways to probably define the different parts of the electric system that require attention and what the issues are. My approach here is to look at sustainability from three basic perspectives. One, obviously, is economic. The costs have to be manageable. The cost to consumers have to be reasonable. That is obviously, that's probably the most prominent driver that we're all aware of. The technical domain, though, encompasses many, many different facets, which I'll go into in a little more detail, but reliability and availability of assets, how long they last, because of the investments are so large, we really have there's a lot of priority on long life of assets, safe operations for those that work in the industry, lot of considerations, and as I'll discuss maybe a little bit further, the knowledge we need to operate the assortment of generation assets that we have, preserving that knowledge itself is a challenge. And then, of course, obviously, environmental and public health impacts. We don't want to adversely affect the environment or public health either at all or any more than absolutely necessary. So as you can all recognize, every one of these things encompasses some pretty complicated considerations, and there are interconnections between them. So let's just briefly, I'd like to take a look at each of these dimensions and in just summary, just to make sure we are kind of on the same page as with respect to what they consist of. From an economic perspective, obviously, lower consumer costs has always been a very important consideration. We have institutions and advocacy groups around the country that pursue that goal. Equitable cost allocation, not only for those who invest in and build and operate assets, but also for those who pay for electricity. That's a very important consideration. Obviously, there are many political aspects of that. Developing criteria based on cost for choosing asset types, technologies that we want to invest in, and then developing and deploying those assets. And of course, managing capital requirements and lifetime costs are critical because these are often, if not the largest, among the very largest costs that owners and operators of these generation assets face. So the very viability of the companies that operate these assets is often impacted severely by what the capital requirements are. So that in itself, the viability of the industry is important to manage those issues. And then finally, of course, stability of costs. Both on the capital side and on the consumer side, we don't have a high tolerance for a lot of volatility. And so that desire leads to a lot of important choices, and very particular as it relates to the types of fuels that we rely on to produce electricity. If we look at technical sustainability, there's a lot of information on this slide, but it's in some sense necessary to convey the complexity in this asset. We obviously want assets to be reliable and available. And I think some of the people in this audience may understand these concepts, but I just want to clarify this. Availability means it will be there when you call on it, and reliability means it will run when you want it to run. And they're not exactly the same thing. And then, of course, longevity of assets. And that leads to many implications as it relates to how we operate and maintain the power plants. And that leads to some interesting interconnections between different types of technologies that we have in the generation mix. Safe operations. We want to be safe for the people that are involved, and we also want to develop technologies and operate these assets in a way where we can reasonably expect to be able to train people and preserve the knowledge needed to sustain the system into the future. And that's not a small problem at all. Dispatchability. We need to be able to produce electricity when we want to, when we need to do that, and that implies considerations as it relates to fuels for different types of assets and how available the fuel is, whether there can be interruptions to the availability of that fuel. And then, of course, ultimately, when you integrate those things, you need an asset mix that is scalable. You want to be able to produce electricity on a scale that's appropriate from an economic, environmental, and technical perspective. It isn't always optimum to have small distributed resources, nor is it optimum to always have large central stations. And you want to enable the utilization of advanced technologies in transmission and distribution and the advanced grid technologies that have been emerging for several years now. So you want your asset mix to interface well with that. And this operational flexibility issue I mentioned on the last bullet here is very important as it relates to the coexistence of some of the different assets that are in the mix. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. And finally, we get to the third dimension of sustainability as I see it, which is the environmental and public health aspects. Clearly, controlling or eliminating pollutants is a primary goal for many reasons, not just for public health, but also for impacts on the environment, biodiversity issues. There are many kinds of pollutants, depending on the types of technology we're talking about: particulates, greenhouse gases, other types of noxious gases. And another aspect of environmental impacts is also remediation. Ultimately, power plants do get closed. Ultimately, the recovery of fuel, the other parts of the infrastructure to deliver electricity create environmental impacts. At times, when the issue of how easy it will be to remediate those impacts is very important. And therefore, choices of technologies has to be taken into consideration. And then, of course, another really important issue is in choosing technologies and understanding how to build a generation mix. How easy is it to measure and monitor the environmental and public health impacts that you will create? And for example, greenhouse gases have a wide complex impact. There's many direct and indirect effects of greenhouse gases, and measuring that in a comprehensive way that is agreed upon is in itself quite a challenge. On the opposite side of the coin, you might look at, for example, say high-level waste from nuclear power plants. Definitely a long-term management issue. That is a very big challenge. But the waste is solid and it's much more finite in its physical dimension and its quantity. And so the problems are different there. So understanding those different problems as far as monitoring and measurement are important influences on developing the generation portfolio. So, okay, fine, if that's the definition of sustainability, why is that important? And I think in addition to the existing well-understood reasons for why electricity is so important, it's an integral part of life and economic activity, it's playing a greater role as we look forward. More flexibility in how we consume energy is a very important asset in terms of how economic growth is accomplished and how our economy evolves and changes as we become more globalized. Many studies, including many by EPRI, which I had some contact with, have shown that increased electrification of the economy generally reduces the cost and increases the likelihood of being able to reduce the carbon intensity of the overall economy if you can increase the amount of electricity that's used as opposed to other energy sources. And those types of considerations increase further the urgency to develop a portfolio, a generation technology portfolio that really is sustainable from all these different perspectives because of these added values that are emerging and becoming more important. And as I mentioned earlier, we've had a lot of previous research that suggests that this is true. Interestingly, though, as in the last, well, I guess I can go back 20 years, certainly at least, but in the last 20 years, while a lot of these aspects are recognized, the actual way in which the generation portfolio has evolved in the United States has not necessarily followed a treatment of all these issues holistically, but rather more in the sense of looking at how to address cost issues and some reliability issues, and then subsequently trying to address some of the other issues. And we'll get into that in a little more detail as we go on here. Okay, so assuming that you accept the premise that sustainability is a desirable attribute, and then ask questions, well, so what? You know, what material impact does it have, and why isn't the processes that we have now, why aren't they adequate, really? And you know, my perspective there would be, first of all, we're not necessarily considering all the issues a priori. As I said earlier, we're sometimes considering addressing issues after the fact. And so an example of that would be, we would see assets built because the capital cost is lower. And then we get to a point where we might have a larger share of generation from a particular asset type than we would like. A small example would be, not this recent year, but a few years ago, we had, you know, a really big freeze in the United States, a weather event that led to an interruption in gas supply for several natural gas plants, and it was necessary to make, for several areas, to make decisions about the availability of gas between residential and non-power uses, and power uses of gas, and those residential uses generally took precedence. That interrupted energy generation supply, and that led to, you know, other effects that were undesirable. That stemmed largely from the fact that we have moved to a more gas-dependent generation mix over the past several years because the cost of gas has been low in the last several years for very many reasons. So that type of situation begs the question, is there a way to create a framework that makes it more easy for all the stakeholders to recognize and address different issues in what constitutes a sustainable generation technology mix upstream when decisions are being made either for regulation purposes, for asset investment purposes, for research purposes. And that's what I'd like to explore a little bit more. So this picture here is just, this came from, I believe this came from Yale University from one of their projects. Ramesh suggested we include this because it illustrates how many different stakeholders there are and how interconnected they are. And you know, we take a long time to go through this chart and describe every asset of it, or every aspect of it. But the important thing to recognize is that there are different priorities emerging from different parts of this chart. And So reconciling those priorities when the decisions are not all made in a single place or a single organization, it makes the situation very complicated. And that's exactly what I want to convey, that if we could address that complexity and increase the likelihood of decision-making, which utilizes a shared framework for understanding these different aspects of sustainability and how they should be addressed, which inevitably will involve trade-offs as different groups have different interests, that will facilitate a more optimum generation portfolio mix as we look forward into the decades. And, I just decided to call out a few examples here just to give an idea of how the complexities in that diagram manifest. One, obviously, is you typically see cost drives investment decisions pretty much. I would even say sometimes capital cost, the initial cost up front, drives a decision as much as the lifetime cost. Sometimes decisions are made to pursue assets that may not have the lowest lifetime cost because they are expensive initially. Then we rely on regulation to achieve environmental and public health objectives. So that's something we impose on the asset mix as a separate constraint. And the utility companies recognize the technology issues as well, I think, but very often they're constrained by regulation, by rate cases that allow them to justify or not justify costs. And so as a result of that, we don't always see every facet of availability or reliability, as an example, addressed. And that's why you see in some of the markets, wholesale energy markets around the country, you see special market products that have been created to incent the deployment or operation of different assets to deliver availability or reliability that otherwise might not just emerge from the fundamental structure of the market itself. So that's sort of evidence that not all these issues are being treated upstream. And that leads to the final comment about we have effectively an organically evolved generation portfolio, which I think has done has been very effective in many respects, but clearly isn't necessarily addressing all of these issues in an optimum way. And as we look forward towards new challenges like greenhouse gas emissions or an increased reliance on electrification, we may not necessarily have as optimum a generation mix in the future unless these issues are addressed in a more holistic fashion. Some other features of the whole environment around power generation that I think that make it a particularly difficult challenge. Obviously, the time horizons are very, very long. Nuclear plants are currently operating to 60 years, may well be operating to 80 years or longer. Coal plants operate at least 30 to 40 years. While we have less experience operating natural gas or natural gas combined cycle units that long, because they're becoming more baseload, closer to baseload assets rather than assets that are only called on periodically, there's more emphasis now on making them longer lived assets. So very long time horizons. The way we consume electricity differs substantially between industrial customers, residential customers, and commercial customers. By that, I mean, stores, restaurants, smaller scale facilities. All these priorities competing against one another. Particularly, we have a lot of advocacy around the country who are very focused on addressing different issues related to either environment or cost or public health. Different states want different things. You have, for example, California, which has made decisions that relate to increasing renewables to the extent that they're willing to import power from other states rather than have assets of other types present in California. Then you have other states that have very different generation mixes, and many studies have been done that show how that geographical diversity in the composition of generation lead to some interesting challenges. And then, as I commented earlier, electricity markets have a tendency to drive towards the most cost-efficient solutions, and then there are reactions with other market products to address other desires that we have. And that has led to, well, there are many issues that have created that, and then there are some responses to that. Capacity markets were created to make sure we had adequate capacity for backup when we increased the amount of renewables and therefore had a little more intermittency in generation. We have mandated generation levels for renewables in some areas of the country. We've created incentive payments in some markets to take an asset that otherwise would not operate purely based on its competitiveness market-wise, but we give them payments through the market operator to operate in order to ensure reliability and stability of the system. So those are all give you a sense of the diversity of challenges that face the power system. And as a result of that, I think there's a strong argument for wanting to look at these different aspects of sustainability upstream when asset decisions are made for investment and for deployment, as opposed to after the fact. I generated this picture. I think there are other versions of this that others have done. This is not unique, but what it does is it tries to outline all these different facets of sustainability and then look at generation technologies in relation to those different aspects. And I chose to pick what I sort of think of as the big five, nuclear, coal, natural gas combined cycle renewables. There obviously are other power sources that have a smaller generation share, but I think this illustrates the point that no one technology really delivers everything that you want. And if you're concerned about one particular issue, for the vast majority of cases, you need to you will have some technologies that can deliver that aspect, longevity, for example, or scalability, and some that cannot. So this sort of illustrates the point that a mix of technology will be needed to balance the shortcomings or weaknesses that some technologies have with the desire to deliver all these facets of sustainability. The basic color coding here is red is, relatively speaking, a weaker area for the technology. The lighter color red is weak, but not so weak. And then the green is the same idea. The dark green suggests that technology is effective at addressing that issue. And a lighter green means it's to some degree effective. So these are my perspectives after a lot of years, but I think this kind of perspective is what is needed in order to figure out how to develop a framework that addresses the spectrum of these considerations upfront. And so I think it's important from a standpoint of disclosure to talk about a few assumptions underlying my perspectives here. The assumptions I'm operating on are that for now, we're going to continue to deliver electricity just in time. So, as many of you probably aware, our system produces electricity in response to current demand. So it's, relatively speaking, an instantaneous system. I'm going to assume that central station capacity, large plants, will continue to remain essential at some level, given the fact that we have an increasing amount of assets which are really not dispatchable. Renewables whose fuel supply fluctuates based on factors we can't control, or distributed generation owned by customers who may not choose to operate those assets when it would be optimal for the grid. Wholesale markets and the regulation of retail electricity will continue as it's currently is. And that the basic composition of the stakeholder community, as shown on that earlier slide, will remain as it is as well, so that we have a distributed decision-making process. So those are the assumptions I've based my perspectives here on. However, if you think about those assumptions, there are some things that could be game changers to this, and I thought it'd be worthwhile to briefly point those out. And this is not a complete list by any means, but obviously, if we could decouple generation and consumption by having substantial scale of energy storage, which would allow us to generate when we want, basically, and consume at a different time, that would require several things. It would require a large amount of storage. It will require storage which can discharge quickly and cycle a lot. And that's a whole domain of technical work, but that would be a game changer if we were to achieve that. I think that if we had distributed generation that was essentially embedded in buildings, like in my imagination, for example, it might be something like embedded solar, so that buildings essentially are zero energy. That's just part of their construction, as opposed to a separate, subsequently installed system or something like that. That would radically change the pattern of energy consumption and would lead to some very different needs that would probably be positive for the demands on the power system. And then, of course, another possibility would be if we were to see evolution in the combination of regulation and energy markets, which shape the structure for how energy is priced, an evolution which recognizes some of these issues and maybe builds in structure which more upstream addresses reliability issues, say, for example, a capacity need, or the interaction between dispatchable and non-dispatchable assets. that would also change the equation in terms of some of the demands. Those would be very positive developments. And I'm sure there are others, but it is this, in a sense, looking at these assumptions also helps us recognize areas where further research could be very, very beneficial. So the natural question would be then, if we've looked at all of these issues and we see this complex environment and these dimensions of sustainability are very challenging, and maybe if you accept the premise that we need some sort of framework that is shared by different stakeholders, well, what then? What can we do? We're not likely to be able to change the institutional structure of the different stakeholders that are out there. Well, I think there are some things that can be done, both on I would say, a sort of a decision-making level and or decision tools level and on a level of technology. From a decision tools perspective, I think a lot of work that's already been done has suggested that the concept of an optimal, and I'll put that word in quotes, generation technology portfolio can be identified. It's possible to identify that if you try to consider all these factors. A lot of energy economic analyses have done that and identified that. So the challenge, though, is how can we could a framework be created that would make it more tractable for different stakeholders, some of whom are not technical people, like policymakers, to grapple with these different issues, make value judgments, and render decisions which support evolving towards an optimum power generation mix. So that area of research, I think, has a strong foundation based on work that's already been done, as I've outlined here on the slide. Several groups have looked at this kind of analysis. And so a lot more work could be done in this area, I think, too, but with an outcome that's more towards not just identifying what's the cheapest or what's the most environmentally desirable or which assets will help us get towards greenhouse gas mitigation best, but rather move forward to a point where these tools could be used to identify a framework that stakeholders could all use to help make the decisions they are responsible for and to advocate or oppose decisions. If you create a common basis for discussion, it's much more likely to reach consensus upstream of asset investment and deployment decisions. And at the end of the day, obviously, this whole idea of a framework really is a risk hedging aspect, since we cannot always predict what's going to happen in terms of energy consumption, energy prices, availability of fuels, or externalities like new environmental considerations, which require a change in what we're doing. I mean, new is a relative term, but I think in the general policymaker consciousness, the greenhouse gases and climate change is something which has become a very significant consideration in just the last 15 years or so. From another perspective, well, actually, maybe continue a little bit further along on this dimension. I think that you can look at the body of work in energy economic modeling that's been done, and meta-analysis can be done. A lot of expansion integration is possible across those efforts to tease out what this framework could be, and I think that's a fruitful research direction to be considered. I think that one thing that will happen if that's attempted is that a much harder look will be made at how do you define metrics that define what optimal really is when you look at all these different dimensions of sustainability. And that work of defining what those metrics really are itself needs to be done and is a very valuable area for research. I think lastly here, there is an opportunity to prioritize technology R&D if you recognize where different technologies offer opportunities and have some liabilities. If we could, for example, focus on research which increases dispatchability, increasing energy storage, increases scalability, increases operational flexibility. There are many areas you can see if progress were made in those areas would particularly deliver a benefit when you consider the way in which different generation technologies play against each other. Okay, so what I'd like to do is maybe entertain a few questions here, and I think we're probably going to be going back into the slides maybe to illustrate some points in response to some of those questions. So, Ramesh, I'd like to entertain a few questions if that's possible.
Okay. All right, very good. So as we do in the past, I'd like to questions to be offered first by students. So students, please, if you want to ask a question, please unmute yourself and go ahead. Others, if you're too shy to use the audio, put it in the chat box, and between Susan and I, we will key them up for Revis. Right, questions from the audience, from students? Okay, don't want to unmute yourself, or what? Okay, let's see. We do have a question in the chat box. Susan, I'll go ahead and read it. Absent regulatory mandates, is there any solely economic incentive to incorporate sustainable resources in the U.S. power grid, Revis? Absent regulatory mandates.
Yeah, I think I understand that. Well, first, I would say, first of all, there's a lot of depth to that question, actually, as simple as it may sound. But the short answer I would start with is no. I think it's unlikely that a market which is designed to identify lowest cost options for producing electricity is likely to produce. It could produce a sustainable mix of technologies, depending on a lot of externalities, but there isn't any way to assure that. If cost is the primary driver, and markets primarily are driven by optimizing cost. The most competitive in an economic sense, technologies are the ones that succeed. This is why, again, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen in some of the markets that separate market products have been created by the market operators to create an opportunity for a payment to an asset which provides something else other than just the lowest cost power. It provides capacity, which is needed at key moments when additional energy is needed, or it provides reliability or grid stability. The necessity of creating those market instruments suggests that markets intrinsically themselves don't necessarily produce all facets of sustainability. And certainly from an environmental impact perspective, there is no explicit signal to the markets regarding environmental impact. For example, the discussion that has always circulated around whether or not there should just simply be a straight carbon tax as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions. From an economist perspective, the attractiveness of that is that creates a very explicit signal, and then markets would respond to that signal. But we don't have that generally. So as a result, that's another facet of sustainability you couldn't really expect necessarily coming from a purely market-driven environment.
Okay. Students,
so
Ian, if you have a question?
Hi, Revis. Hey, this is Andrew Coleman. Hey, how are you?
Hey, good. Andy, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. On that note, with regard to decarbonization, I wanted you to maybe, if you could elaborate on this. I've noticed a trend, especially let's just pick out a subject here with regard to decarbonization. Let's say we know that the commercial and industrial sectors of the United States account for quite a bit of the ability to decarbonize, and of course that's all scheduled upon cost and benefit. So if we're going to be asking industrial companies or commercial companies to decarbonize, either there's subsidy involved or it makes just good sense to decarbonize because of the efficiencies. So one of the things I've noticed, and this has come up with World Economic Forum, where there's a large cluster of decarbonization potential with regard to industrial, but the incentive for decarbonizing industrial and converting to other renewable fuels is incentivized by a carbon price. And is it true that it will probably be a little harder in the United States to move the industrial sectors into the pinch zones, or into looking at waste heat, or looking into some of these other factors without a carbon tax to incentivize it here, and would it take a little longer? So I'd like to get your opinions on that, because I know you spent quite a bit of time working in Europe and seeing the wheels grinding on this for quite some time, and thought maybe you could impart some
yeah, Andy, I think
thoughts.
let me give you sort of a two-part answer to that as I see it. First of all, let me just start with the European perspective, and just let me a quick preamble to that part of my answer. I actually, in addition to my time in Paris when I was with EPRI and I was working on acting as a liaison on the research programs at two organizations, I did spend 3 years in London just recently as a result of my wife's job. But I spent time there observing how power is managed in England or UK. And one thing I see in Europe that I think is somewhat substantially different than here in the States. So this is to your one part of your question. I think there is a much more there's a much closer tie between corporate strategy in Europe and government policies. And part of that reason is that many of the power companies are partly owned by governments or very closely connected to the governments. And as a result, the strategic priorities that those organizations operate by are partially public policy goals. So the companies may not make a decision exclusively on the basis of, say, a shareholder return or something like that. These other considerations are accepted in the environment they operate in. In the United States, as I see it, that's much less the case. Industrial companies are big power consumers or are principally looking at profitability, obviously, and shareholder returns if they are publicly traded. And so I think that they have to have a signal if any of these things are going to happen. And as you said, we don't have a carbon tax or some other kind of a signal. Obviously we can make a regulation about anything. It's possible regulations could be made that dictate companies have to do certain things, but personally, I think that the choice is really the grand choice that exists is either you create a market signal around other aspects of sustainability that are valuable to society, such as greenhouse gases, for example, or it could be about reliability, for example. Or if you don't want to create that signal because it creates an economic impact that's not desired or is not agreed upon, then you have to, after the fact, implement some form of regulation to achieve those goals. And in both of those cases, the government is going to be the proxy for those social interests. That's essentially the choice that you are confronted with, as I see it.
Yeah, thank you. That confirms my supposition. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Andrew, you have a question? Andrew Zetlin?
Yes, thank you. Revis, I'm a Lehigh alum and I work for Hitachi Energy.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, and thanks for the information. A couple of things that I wanted to ask. One is related to something I don't think you covered, which is pump storage and hydro.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You didn't mention hydro a lot. Pump storage is certainly a way. It's nature's sort of battery system, and you didn't cover that or suggest it. And then the other question is, you also covered everything as though it's in a completely regulated environment. You didn't discuss deregulated environments, except perhaps through the marketplace. What about those end consumers, particularly industrial consumers, who develop their own microgrids and depart the grid, and literally are either unattached or have tie points that they keep it pretty much zero and never become a buyer, but are willing to become a seller at times that doesn't impact their industrial schedules?
Okay, those are excellent comments, and so let me just try to address those in part here. As it relates to storage, the pump storage is incredibly valuable, and of course we do have significant pump storage facilities here in the United States. I think this is maybe a little bit dated, but I think the U.S. power system on average has about 2.5 or 3% of total storage. If you look at the energy that we can contain in storage that relates to the total capacity of our system. Europe, by contrast, for example, has about 7.5% or so. and for a lot of different reasons. I think that's a very valuable resource, and I think hydroelectric power obviously is an outstanding resource. It's just that, and I probably should have put it on that chart there because it deserves to be considered. But it would be, to me, it would be in the category of a very high capital, high environmental impact option that has many very desirable attributes, like the low cost of power production and reliability and so on. And storage would be a very big player. I think what history is showing is that the development of storage facilities is a sizable undertaking, and therefore it has been tackled by some power companies or some other entities, but not a lot. So it's an option. I would say it's an option on the table. It's something that should definitely be considered. It would have, in my mind, some strengths and some trade-offs, just like anything else. And it would be part of the equation when you're looking at this question of, quote, a sustainable generation mix. I would fully agree with that. The microgrid question, I think, is a really interesting one. There's a lot of, in my mind, uncertainty about what the future may hold there. We could move into a world possibly where we do have sizable chunks of energy consumption that sort of exist within their own sort of grid. That could happen. I won't profess to say that I fully grasp all the conditions that have to happen to make that happen. I'll just make a few observations based on my past experience with some of the research I have been involved with. One was a project that I was involved with when I was at EPRI. Oh gosh, it's probably been, admittedly, 15 years ago or so, so it's been a little bit of time. But the interesting part of that project was we were talking to a lot of different companies who were not power companies or involved in producing electricity. There were companies that simply relied on electricity for either a lot of it or they needed very high reliability electricity. And the basic question that we were interested in answering was, were these people, these organizations in these communities interested in investing in development of research that would lead to technology that would serve their interests better? Or perhaps even be a participant in directing where that research goes. And while there were individual organizations who were interested, the collective answer, generally speaking, was not that much. And so our natural question was, well, why? Why would you not be interested, considering your business, what you do, whether metals or making chips, things like that? And the short answer was, in a purely financial perspective, not thinking about the power sector per se. They said it's more cost effective for us to have business interruption insurance that insures us against the negative impacts if electricity doesn't meet the parameters we require. And so from a business perspective, we've opted to insure ourselves against those eventualities as opposed to create more technology conditions more amenable to what we would like. So I found that to be a really interesting answer. I guess to respond to your question, perhaps the question would be, that would be an area to be explored. What is the relationship between the financial attractiveness of investing in technology, creating microgrids, all the other things that would go with that? You obviously need to have fuel, you'll need to have some other infrastructure to support that, versus a reliance on the power system and then dealing with the negative things that delivers. I would just say that's a genuine question to be further explored if I was saying that's a research direction to look at.
Yeah, I think we should start in Texas, but that's just my humble opinion.
It offers an excellent laboratory, doesn't it? My family's from Texas. I have a lot of people down there. So I first
thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure, of course. Thanks for the question.
Okay, Nate has raised his hand. Nate Nichols, unmute yourself, Nate, first. Yeah.
Hey, I'm really interested in this and appreciate you joining. Nate Nichols, I'm an engineer over at Electric Utility here in Pennsylvania.
Nice to meet you.
And an alum of the Lehigh ESE program. With that, though, one of the things I'm getting more involved with lately is looking at FERC Order 2222, which is kind of FERC's attempt to allow for small solar panel and small distributed energy resources to bid into the wholesale market. And so my question is kind of from your perspective, do you see that as an opportunity where it actually may help drive some of the sustainability aspects that you're looking at and talking about? And do you think that there actually will be potentially maybe incentive for industrial or commercial industries where they may not have some of the economics that are favorable to them to actually think through this and maybe see that as another stream or source of income that may play out into more widespread adoption of DER.
I think from my perspective, I would offer two viewpoints. One would be that I think that ties back to the discussion I was having with Andy Coleman a minute ago, in that the desirable features that a particular technology brings, say more distributed solar, if those features are not monetized in some way, as in terms of a market signal, then you're faced with either a company deciding that those features deliver value to that company, and therefore they're willing to make a unilateral decision to invest in it, or there has to be some other motivator to cause people to use it, which would be regulations or incentives, tax incentives or whatever it might be. The other perspective, I would say, just purely speaking on a technical perspective, I certainly am not a solar expert per se, but speaking as a kind of a generation guy and looking at all these different technologies, I think scalability is always good. What I have learned in my research is that the ability to have a generation mix which has assets which can produce power at many different levels is very desirable, because the interconnection of the grid and because of the overlay of different consumption patterns, especially now that we have changing consumption patterns that relate to how businesses operate, how people consume electricity, the penetration of electricity into our society, but also we're seeing a change in patterns from things like the COVID pandemic created a change in load curves. Those changes in patterns require responsiveness, and responsiveness is hard to achieve if all your assets are of a certain size, big or small. It's nice to have spread. So this is a perspective that I would say is an opinion, but I have an intuition that an asset which contributes to that scalability, the overall generation mix, is probably going to bring value. The question would be, how do you capture what that value is? How do you measure it or quantify it in such a way that people can see it and decide to invest in it? That is a question I don't have an answer to. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Nate. Okay, please guys, ask questions of Revis. We still have a lot of time here. Let me read off a question on the chat box. Let me pull up a question. A couple of more questions rolled in. But do you see, Revis, for you, do you see combined heat and power becoming a more prevalent energy source in future commercial building construction? Why or why not?
Combined heat and power.
Cogeneration at commercial.
Yeah, I know. I'm just pondering. I'm pondering that question. What is my first reaction to how prevalent I see that? I mean, obviously, the energy efficiency of the overall package is very attractive. So clearly, it's good. And in a world where natural gas is relatively inexpensive, it's even more attractive. The one thing about combined heat and power that comes to my mind, though, that's a bit of a constraint is, you need some proximity. The facilities which are going to utilize the heat aspect of the process, need to be somewhat near the source where you're producing that heat. And so are the opportunities for deploying that technology widespread enough that it's a technology would grow much more than it has already grown? I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I mean, obviously in the old days, we had district heating kind of systems, and you'd have areas of cities or like where you have a university that would have that. I'm uncertain. I'm not certain how much that sort of location constraint might play a role in the expansion of that. That's the best I can really do. I'm not really sure beyond that.
Let's see, there's from Hal, assuming we may have to move to a zero carbon future by 2050, how do you see the US moving towards that eventually?
Based on the work that I've been involved with, the work that I'm more deeply familiar with has looked at exactly those kinds of questions, how rapidly we would have to change the generation mix to achieve various goals. I think in my mind, I can't see how that's achievable in the United States short of a pretty aggressive transition to completely non-emitting power generation for part one. So that would mean to me a lot more nuclear and a lot more renewables, a lot more, probably with some a lot of energy efficiency programs thrown in to reduce, to tamp down on demand so that you don't have to get past the capacity provided by those resources. And the second observation I would make is it would also entail aggressive electrification of the rest of the economy as much as you possibly can in order to leverage that decarbonized electricity to as great extent possible. So to achieve, if you have any hope of achieving a zero carbon economy, what I have learned is that decarbonizing other parts of the economy outside of power, things where we don't use electricity, is directly a much more difficult process because of the variety of different technology required decarbonization, because the sources are all so small. There's so many numerous small point sources. So if you can just increase the permeation of electricity, you can attack that much more effectively. And a lot of the studies that I've been involved with show that from an economic perspective, that's probably the most efficient way to get there. It would be hard though. It would not be easy. There'll be a lot of dislocation, I think, for people in terms of business and economic and policy impacts to do that. I wouldn't want to minimize how hard that is, but that's what I think would have to happen.
So related to that, Revis, people have said one answer to decarbonizing other industries is SMR, small modular reactors, or small nuclear assets. What are your views on that?
Well, it goes back to an earlier answer. We were discussing small distributed solar a minute ago. I think that obviously nuclear delivers a lot of positives in terms of zero emissions, in terms of high reliability, longevity. So these small SMRs would probably come with some other benefits, in the long run, lower cost because of their more passive designs, because of the scale of the reactor, but also they would deliver that scalability feature I was talking about. You would have the ability to, for example, create capacity in smaller increments and maybe have more flexibility in where you put that capacity, which would have an impact on requirements for the transmission system. I see many benefits that would emerge from that option, but preserving all the positive attributes from an emission standpoint that nuclear would provide.
Okay. We have a question in the chat box from Oshan. Countries like Norway and Uruguay are currently generating greater than 90% of their electricity from renewable resources. Can you stress the importance of having a generation mix than pursuing something like 100% renewables?
Well, I think that question, important to put that question in maybe the context of what is encompassed under the definition of renewables. That probably is a long discussion by itself. But I will say for myself, renewables are assets where you can basically assume the fuel source is infinite. There's going to be wind, there's going to be sun, rain will fall, reservoirs fill, rivers run. You can expect to find the fuel source. So to me, hydroelectric power, solar, wind, wave energy, geothermal, those are all things that fall into the renewables umbrella for me. So then the question becomes, okay, you want 100%, do you want 100% renewable generation mix? I think from the standpoint of the emission standpoint, from the standpoint of fuel costs, that would be very desirable. The one problem is some of those assets are not dispatchable. And so this goes back to my earlier comment about the assumption that we still have a just-in-time energy system. I think that as long as we have a system where there's a very tight linkage between the consumption and the level of consumption from second to second and the power we're generating, that dispatchability criterion is extremely important, which means that we probably cannot successfully operate a system with too large a share of non-dispatchable resources. You can dispatch a hydro dam, you can increase or decrease water flows, but it's not so easy to do that for wind and solar. However, if we were to achieve very large quantities of storage, like pumped hydro we were talking about a minute ago, if we were willing to take on the challenge of building more pumped hydro facilities, even with the substantial cost and maybe environmental footprint that requires, let's say that there were some battery breakthroughs that we don't know about now, that would make that much more cost effective. Then if you could decouple generation and consumption, then I think you could consider a 100% renewable portfolio much more easily.
Question in the chat box from Glenn. How do you sustainably fund safety protection of nuclear waste during the time it is dangerous?
Well, how do we fund it? I think the question was how to sustainably fund it, I believe, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not sure what sustainably funding something exactly means, but what I would say is that the cost of nuclear power is that you have to have substantial money allocated towards the management of waste, high-level waste, the spent fuel primarily, which means that what we have now today is we have a system which for the time being has absorbed and managed all that waste successfully, although in the long run, if we were to go much more nuclear than we are now, I think we would have to have some additional storage facilities. But for the moment, what we do is we store spent fuel in fuel pools until it cools down, and then it's put into dry casks, and those casks are kept on sites. And the entire volume of all the waste that we've generated by our nuclear assets for the moment resides on those sites, and that has worked well. And the cost of doing that has been absorbed as part of the overall cost of nuclear power, which of course means that in the end, the consumer is paying for that in part. If you were to scale up nuclear, I think we would have to have long-term storage in order to sustain much larger amount of nuclear. So that would be a cost we would have to bear. I don't personally think that the financial or the technical issues are a barrier, though, to that. I think the question mark there, which is a genuine question to be discussed, is it does have to be managed for a very long time, even at lower levels of reactivity. You have to make investments in technology decisions to rely on facilities and technologies that give you confidence that these things can be stored for a long time. There's a risk that you can be wrong. So how do you view those risks in relation to the risks you take on if you choose not to utilize nuclear power? That is the question. And one of my motivations in thinking about this whole framework discussion that I was offering in the presentation is precisely that, making those value judgments in a way where it's observable to all the stakeholders. People can see clearly what the trade-offs are, and it is a more conscious decision to choose between the proportion of technology we use, as opposed to an evolutionary decision that somewhat emerges as an after effect of financial decisions. That's almost to the heart of what I was trying to present.
Another question in the chat box from Adi Duran. Any prospect of using hydrogen gas as alternative to fuel, natural gas for power generation?
I think there's a challenge there. And the challenge I see there is, basic engineering. The more energy transformations you have, the more loss of energy you encounter. So you have to have compensating benefits if you're going to entail that. Obviously, to make hydrogen, we have to do something. We have to have a process, and making hydrogen generally takes energy. And then now hydrogen brings a value. It can be stored. So there is a value there. And then that allows you to have later use of energy. So what has to be evaluated is the energy cost and financial cost of producing hydrogen versus the value of the storage it provides. The answer to that question probably is dependent on the other technologies you have in your generation mix at the same time. I mean, the value of that storage will probably be higher if you have a more renewables mix or 100% renewables mix than it would be if you have, say, a balanced portfolio where you have dispatchable assets where the value of storage maybe is not as important. So my own expectation, I don't think hydrogen is going to be a primary alternative fuel, if you want to refer to it that way, for all those reasons. But if it were going to be, I think it would be because the storage value would rise to a level where it would offset the added energy costs of going through the transformations to get hydrogen and then burn it again.
Okay. Revis, any more questions for Revis? Speak up or put it in the chat box. So Revis, could you comment on just a business model that utilities are operating under? Is that somehow an impediment to meeting all these sustainability goals? I think you pointed that out, that there's some pricing is so important. And
well, okay, so that's the answer to that question, Ramesh, is probably a little bit, I mean, it's a little bit controversial that I could offend somebody here. So I will say, I'll preface this by saying, this is my opinion as an individual, albeit I've had my share of experience. I'm not going to pronounce that I have all the knowledge, but I think the process that they operate now is an impediment to some degree, because I think it's primarily a cost-driven process. I mean, there are many, many aspects to it, and utilities are very sophisticated organizations, and they recognize all these different issues that I have identified. And in many cases, I think many utility companies have attempted to propose investment decisions which are motivated by addressing many of these factors, but they are often, sometimes they don't make those decisions, sometimes they're not successful in convincing regulators to accept the proposals that they make, because I think electricity, unfortunately, when you get into the policymaker community and the regulatory community, is mainly viewed from a cost perspective. And so that has a very heavy influence on any proposal that is made with respect to generation technology development or investments in particular assets. And so I think that system they operate under is probably has somewhat of an impediment from the perspective of successfully treating and weighing all of these different aspects of sustainability together, as I see it.
So, in your talk, Revis, you mentioned that electrification is the key to decarbonization. So, should it play a bigger role? As you say, now they're just looking at electricity through the lens of cost alone. What should happen to bring electrification to a kind of a more...
Well, I think, I think, again, now we're in the realm, I think, of speculating a little on what kind of events would have to happen in order to make that occur. My view of it is that, unless we were to have some sort of a carbon tax, which means that all the different producers of carbon would experience costs, and they would therefore modify decisions in response to that, which I think has such far-reaching impacts, and for lots of non-technical reasons, probably there's not a lot of appetite for that. But that would probably be the most efficient thing to do. But if that did not happen, I think that we're going to have some sort of incentive that the governments at the state and federal level provide to make consumers at different levels choose electricity as opposed to other energy sources, so that we can make progress towards decarbonization. And that, of course, is assuming that we've made all the decisions to decarbonize the electric sector in the first place, which in itself is a sizable assumption. But even if that were to occur, I think you'd have to incent transition to electricity. And I think that's really kind of a legacy issue. I mean, much like a business organization wants to change out the computing infrastructure on which it relies, while the necessity to make a change is recognized, the cost of transition from a legacy system is often significant. There's productivity losses, there's a learning curve, there's new capital investments in equipment. And that same challenge exists, I think, in terms of trying to increase electrification across the economy, but it's probably more expensive, obviously, than the example I gave of an information infrastructure. So that's obviously a resistance that slows that down. So you'd have to offer, I think, incentives to get different participants to want to consider doing that. In my opinion, it's probably more successful than some sort of regulation or penalties. It would be probably, incentives are probably likely to achieve the outcome you would want.
Well, any last questions for Revis? You can talk to Revis forever and get these wonderful fountains of wisdom here. So we can keep you here forever, Revis. Well, I can anyway, but
yeah.
Last couple of questions before we let Revis go. Okay, hearing none. Thanks a lot, Revis.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Very interesting presentation. And, we may see Revis more in the coming spring semester. We're talking about modalities and topics and so on. But thanks again, audience, for your attention. We will continue the seminar series with a 2-week gap, October 25th. We'll have a speaker from EPRI again. We'll be talking about managing the grid with high penetration of DERs. So thanks a lot, everybody. Thank you, Revis, and look forward to seeing all of you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your questions.
Hey, Rudy.
Susan, how are you feeling?
I feel better than I did this morning.
Okay.
I think I'm just gonna stick it out.
Are you at work or are you at home?
No, I'm at home.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't even grasp the concept of walking across campus with all my stuff, and it just was not gonna happen.
Well, that's good that you're at home, so at least, you could bail out easily.
Yeah, that's
but-
why I was really glad that his slides worked out, because I I was like, if I have to run to the bathroom if I get sick or something, I'm like, I didn't want to be responsible for flipping slides.
Well, I'll tell you
It
what,
actually turned out really well.
he's a hell of a speaker.
Yeah,
he is
that was
one
really a
heck
good
of a
one.
speaker.
It was disappointing how the current students didn't really ask any questions.
Well, this is pretty high level.
Oh, okay.
And this is, I'm telling you, this is like solving the world's problems. I mean, the topic is so big. And
Yeah.
it's not that it has to be done somehow,
Yeah.
And, if anybody can do it, it's Revis. The guy has got so much knowledge about these things. So
Yeah, he was, and obviously, I mean, with his experience and where he comes from and the levels of
yeah.
employment that he's had, he's a really good speaker.
Well, the good news is I want him to be more involved in our seminars. So he may do 3 seminars in spring, just expand on each of these topics.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
That's good. And
yeah.
just to ease your mind, all of the students, all 8 were in attendance today.
Yes. Yeah, I saw them. Mhm.
Yep. So yeah, it was pretty good.
All right.
All right. Well, if you need me, you know where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, take care of yourself. Are you running a fever on me?
No, you know what? I actually thought that I was this morning. It was just I woke up with a throbbing like migraine headache. And normally I'm like, I tried to
Ooh.
suck it up. I'd sit with an ice pack on my head. And then I thought, okay, well, if I take a shower, 75% of the time when I take a shower, then I feel better after that. I can remember getting out of the shower and feeling clammy and like literally like that clammy feeling like when you do have a fever.
Yeah.
I just did not feel good. And I literally stood there for like 5 minutes going, there's no way that I am gonna make it to campus today. So I thought I had a graduate coordinator meeting this morning. It was with the international office of something. They had all of us in there. They were talking about the tests, and it was mostly what they require of TAs and stuff, and the international tests of language and stuff that they have to go through. But
by the way, I noticed one question was from this fellow who's going to be in our information session, Oshan.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, pretty smart question.
I'm actually catching up on sending out the other certificates. So I was kind of only half hearing the questions.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I see it. Countries like, oh yeah, the countries like Norway, Uruguay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
cool.
hey, listen, I still get migraines, but they're not as bad as they used to be. And I could totally sympathize with you, what you have to go through or something like that.
Sometimes I can ward them off and like kind of like nip them in the bud, but other times I just, doesn't matter what I do. And I've had them for a couple times. I've had them for days. And when I figure out, when I first started getting them, I figured out that a lot of it was because I was severely dehydrated. Like I've not been,
dehydration is a big thing. Yeah.
not been drinking water at all. And then so usually I would chug some water and I'd be good like in a couple hours. So that's what I started doing. I started just massively drinking water. And once I actually ate some breakfast, I felt a little bit better. And then I just slowly, so like, it's like on the cusp, like in the back of my head right now, but it's not anything like it was this morning. It's way better.
Well, this was well attended.
Yep.
Great talk. Really good talk. Well,
Yep,
take
and
care of
the next-
yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, and Deepak, did he get us, I think did he say he was gonna work on getting us the abstract, or did he already get it? I have a lot of emails I have to get through.
I think he sent a picture and he talked about this topic last fall or maybe last spring, sorry.
Oh, I think I asked you that, and I was talking about that I could use the same abstract, but you said he kind of tweaked it a little bit.
Yeah, I think, he's doing some new things and some exciting things too. So,
Yeah, I'll wait to see if he sends an
Yeah.
updated one. And then at the very least, if I get desperate, I'll just use the old one.
yeah.
Yep. And then I got a follow-up message from the lady from the field trip next week. So I just wanted to clarify. So we are not going to do food, right?
No, we're not doing food. Hey,
Okay.
and there is one, this Audrey McSain, she's with the Sustainability Office. I think she wants to come too.
Okay. So I
that'd
have
be
to,
one.
the one thing I do have to do is I have to get, I have to do the field trip form. So I'll put the event and like the date and stuff on it. And then I'll send it out to I'll just send it electronically out to the students and what's the lady's name? Audrey, you said?
Audrey McSain, McSain.
Oh yeah, I remember that name.
And she's
From
she's like
Sustainability.
maybe she's I don't know what her position is, but she's like Catherine's deputy.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Well, then I'll be sure to send it out to, and it goes to all the students, right? All the ESE students.
All the ESE students, because technically it is only for the 461. I mean, they have an obligation.
Yeah.
But I've told folks in 401 and 461. They aren't very different.
Even the ones that just took it, like one of the classes is like a one-off class.
Yeah.
I can invite. Okay. All right, I will do that. I'll make sure I get
Well,
that.
no, just ask them. I don't know. I mean, I asked Ellen, she's a mechanical engineer.
Yeah, that's the one. That's specifically who I was
And
thinking.
Margaret Hutner. Oh, well,
Yep.
Margaret has to go. I'm sorry. She will be there.
Yeah, Ellen is the one that's kind of like the wild card.
Ellen's right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Ellen and maybe Carolyn. Carol, sorry.
Oh, Carol Bando. Okay, yeah, and then how do you want me to send the email? Oh, I just got an email from one of the persons who attended the seminar. I'm sorry, it just popped up. It says, do you offer energy systems engineering program at the PhD level?
It's probably the same damn guy. What's his name?
I can't even pronounce it. It's
Adidiran.
Yeah, there you go. You're so good at pronouncing
he asked
it.
a question too, by the way.
Yeah, I think I did see that.
And I think he asked this question a long time. I mean, this PhD question. I may have answered him too. The answer was no, we don't. But hey,
Come and take the master's program.
yeah.
So real quick, how did you want me to present it to the students? Like, are you talking to them about what the whole day of the field trip will
Yes.
entail? So I can just say, here's the field trip form that you need to sign and get back to me, and Professor Shankar will have all the rest of the details, kind of sort of thing.
Well, like what? Well, they're
Well,
aware
I
of.
mean, do they know that they're meeting at the place?
Oh,
Do they
yes,
know
yes,
the-
yes.
the
I reminded
address?
them, given them the address, given them the time slot and everything.
Times, okay, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so that's cool. So then I'll just send out the thing
Yeah,
requesting the sign the form and get back.
yeah. And, if you just may want to reiterate the address, if you want, I can send you the slide I used, today, in fact.
And dumb question, Scott's an adjunct, but do you invite Scott or no?
No, I didn't invite Scott. And, because we used to do tours at PPNL, we kind of made sure Scott was informed.
Okay,
He doesn't
I just didn't know
have
if you want me to send him the form if he was,
to.
on the
Not
invite list.
necessarily. Not
Okay.
necessarily.
Sounds good.
All right, well, take care
All
of
right,
yourself.
Rudy.
I'll see you
Thank you.
tomorrow.
Yes, definitely. Oh, yeah. I reiterated a note to that, to Nicholas to make sure that he saw that you sent a message for a meeting request. So I saw that he hasn't checked off on it yet. So that's why I sent a separate message saying, hey,
Okay.
it was really great that Professor Shankar could find time in his extremely tight schedule to fit you in with your availability.
Well, Tuesday is such a bad day because there's something always, there used to be weekly Zoom conferences, And
Yeah.
now we moved that to Thursday, which I'll have to skip it this Thursday, so.
Oh, you're so in demand, Rudy.
Well, you're an age where, hey, by the way, SEF is going to go ahead and, support a $15,000 scholarship.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I didn't realize, before we used to just look for in-kind contribution, which was not real money that we could use. But this is real money now. And we double our money if SEF puts in 15 and we win the PETA grant, we get another 15.
Wow, that's awesome.
And if SEF wants to put in kind, we get that matching in kind and scholarship monies too.
Whew, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Very cool.
All right.
All right, Mr. Rudy.
Great job. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye.